Hi, it's Pastor Andy and our Wednesday discipleship video. Today I'm going to be looking at the idea of the word deacon and applying that to whether or not the Bible indicates, in my opinion, that a woman can or cannot serve as a deacon, or for that matter, an elder. Now, Romans 16:1 leaves no doubt that Phoebe was a deacon. But as I mentioned yesterday, that word deacon, diakonos, can mean a servant or a minister in a general sense. And every person who is a follower of Christ, who is a part of the church in that way, is meant to be a servant or a minister, not maybe professional like the pastor is, but to be a servant or a minister to others. And therefore, the word deacon would apply in that way. But I do contend that it matters whether or not we think of Phoebe, and therefore potentially other females, as a deacon, servant, minister, or as a deacon with a capital D, so to speak, even though we shouldn't capitalize that. Now, people debate, they often debate on which roles that women can have in a church. And I realize that there will be people that disagree with my position, but I believe my position is consistent with the Bible, and which is the most important thing. But I also believe that what I'm going to share first is consistent with what our standard of faith is. Kind of the Bible's this true standard, but our statement of faith, let me say it that way, the Baptist Faith and Message, specifically the 2000 version, says, and that is the general set of belief for Southern Baptist. So what is that belief? Let me just state up front. I do believe that women can serve as deacons. The word translated women and the word translated as wives in the New Testament is the exact same word in the Greek. So wherever you see woman or women or wife or wives, the reality is that the context of the sentence helps us to determine what the translation should be. But there are certain places where it is difficult to tell what the writer may have meant. For instance, in 1 Timothy 3:11, it is impossible to know whether Paul was writing that that Greek word gune was meaning wife or was meaning deacon. But the word that he uses is the same word in verse 11 and 12 of 1 Timothy 3, also in verse 8, where it's talking about male deacons. It's the same word that Paul used in Romans 16:1 about Phoebe. Now, let me take a pause here. I believe biblically that is fully supported. I believe that the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 supports that as well. That is my belief. I believe that women can be deacons. Now let me shift where I know I'm going to draw a little bit of difference from people, but I do not believe that Scripture supports that a woman can be an elder or a pastor. But that does not mean that I don't believe that women cannot be leaders at some way within the church. For instance, I believe that there would be many women that would make a better elder because of the characteristics of an elder than many men, just frankly speaking. But just because they might be better equipped to do it doesn't mean that they should do it. I don't find evidence in Scripture that makes the case for a woman pastor. However, I realize there are some that hold the idea of the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 differently from me. I see a difference. I make a distinction between the position and the function. So what I mean by that, and again, this is where there would be some differences as it relates to elders, I will allow, if that's the proper word, for somebody, a woman, to preach from the pulpit, just as I would allow, in the right context, a child or a youth to preach from the pulpit. Not that the woman is a child in that regard, but I don't believe it has to be the pastor who is preaching, and I make a distinction between those who are teaching, even from the pulpit, versus someone who is the pastor of the church. And I make this distinction in part because of 1 Timothy 2:12, which is a critical text in this, that in many Bibles says that Paul doesn't allow a woman to exercise authority over a man. I interpret that word as not exercise authority, but usurp authority. So if a woman is preaching from the pulpit and they are doing so under my authority as the elder of the church, then I don't see a problem with that. And scripturally, I say that's true because the first person to proclaim the gospel was a woman, Mary, to the disciples, that Jesus had not only died, but that he had raised again. And we see in Acts chapter 21, where Philip's daughters, the deacon Philip, his daughters were prophesying, which means proclaiming the message of God. They were preaching in the port town of Caesarea Philippi, and that being such an important town in Israel at the time, that certainly would have had mixed company of male and female. But back to Phoebe, and thus back to Paul. Paul thought that Phoebe's service was especially noteworthy. Again, he called her sister, which was the highest thing in a sense, because she was a child of God, but she didn't just rest on that. She was a servant, and Paul pointed directly to her role as a servant within the church. And again, the way that wording is used, as she is a deacon at her church in Cenchreae, there's debate on how that's pronounced, it seems to make this an official position for Phoebe at that time, not as someone who is just generally serving. But again, she's also called a patron, and the word patron here is in the masculine form. So Phoebe had a special distinction, not that she was male in any way or pretended to be, but that she had the essence of serving, as for some only considered a male would be able to do. Now, I also realize that many people struggle with the Bible because of the predominance of males within Scripture. In the stories that are told, the focus is primarily on males. There are many exceptions, such as Deborah and others within the Bible. But let's understand that the Bible is largely not a story of history, although it encompasses that, but it is the history of the seed of Abraham as it is passed down from generation to generation, and ultimately that seed not being generations, but that seed being Jesus, and how Jesus was the fulfillment of all of those. So the seed, biologically, you may not like it, but biologically the seed comes from the male, and so that's why these stories are predominantly from a male perspective. But Paul was definitely not anti-woman, as some might suggest. Some passages maybe appear that way. Some passages are cultural. They applied to the culture of the day. Some were to the specific town or to the specific thing, and that's a part of 1 Timothy chapter 2, in my opinion. But I would suggest that Paul had a higher view of women than most people did, and we're going to see that in next week's passage, where of the 27 names that he mentions in this part of Romans, 10 of them are mentioning females. Furthermore, let's understand that one of Paul's closest companions was Luke, the doctor. And of course, Luke wrote the book of Luke. He wrote the book of Acts. But it is Luke who shared more about the role of women in the ministry of Jesus than any of the other gospel writers. So if Paul was spending a lot of time around Luke, then that anti-woman thing would have created dissension between them, and we don't have any sense that that is the case within Scripture. So, I don't believe that Paul was anti-woman in any way. I think he was pro-woman from that perspective. It's just a matter of how we look at Scripture, maybe even what preconceptions we bring to Scripture. So, can women be deacons? As I understand Scripture, I say yes. Should women be deacons? That's a different story. The character traits that are identified in 1 Timothy 3 apply to deacon candidates, as I understand it, male or female. Whatever the case, whether women are deacons in your church, should be, or whatever, that's for you to decide. But for all of us, we are all to be servants. We are all to serve the risen Lord. And for those who are called to be a deacon, to have the role, to have the office, to have the title, and therefore the responsibility of being a deacon, it is a responsibility that requires special attention, a special degree of service, male and female alike.